Thank you, Begum, and welcome everyone to this last session, last keynote speech of the symposium. Not the least, I'm very happy to have Professor Marianne Beecher with us this evening. Evening here, but not so, I guess, in the United States. Our ways with Professor Beecher crossed many years ago at a conference at Kingston University. I was very happy to see her there, meet her there. And the same, I'm very happy today to see her and have her here as our keynote speaker, closing keynote speaker at the end of our symposium. Welcome, Marianne. Before I give the floor to you, I would like to introduce you briefly. Read your CV here. Dr. Marianne Beecher is a professor in the Department of Design at the Ohio State University. She has extensive experience as a scholar, a design educator, and an administrator in both the United States and Canada. She has taught at Iowa State University, the University of Oregon, and the University of Manitoba, where she was also the department head of the interior design department from 2008 until 2013. She served as the chair of the Department of Design at Ohio State for 9 years. Dr. Beecher has written critical essays on such wide-ranging topics as the shifting ethical terrain of today's interior design practice, the political nature of interior space, the significance of naming practices in interior design education. I personally think her work on American vernacular interior spaces has been very inspiring for young scholars working on histories of domestic interiors. This research included early 20th century farmhouses, mid-century roadside motels, as well as the kitchens, basements, attics, garages, sheds, and perhaps most importantly, the closets that make up the repertoire of storage spaces in evolving 20th century modern American living environments. Today, the title of her talk is Objects in the Mirror Are Closer Than They Appear. A very provocative title. I'm looking forward to listening to your keynote. The floor is yours, Marianne.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen right off here so that we confirm that my slides are up and running. And indeed, they are. All right. And I'm really glad that I can see the room. Looks like a nice group. We've got a few folks online with us as well, which is wonderful to see too. And I want to start with just a comment about what a pleasure it is to have the opportunity to speak to you. I was really honored to be invited. I think this symposium is very exciting, and my only regret is that I wasn't able to come and be there in person and enjoy participating with you and listening to all your wonderful papers. But I did have the opportunity to visit Izmir not too long ago. It's September 2022, and I met some really wonderful Turkish scholars there at the conference I was attending at the time. And my memories of all the beautiful sights of the old city in Izmir are going to stay with me forever. So I hope you've enjoyed your visit. I hope you have a little bit of time to take a look around Izmir before you return to wherever you call home. Now, I admit that I had to give some thought when I received this invitation to what I might discuss as a keynote talk. And at the time, I didn't know I was the closing speech, which is always kind of a daunting assignment because you've all seen and heard so many wonderful and inspiring things already, and I'm guessing that you might be a little bit tired as well. So I did think about it. I I don't have a recently published book to describe. I don't have a design career that I can showcase as a set of beautiful interiors. Um, so I had to think kind of deeply about what the ingredients of a keynote talk might be. And I thought a little bit about some of the better ones I've heard over the years, and decided that really the ones that have stuck with me have often been the ones that sort of challenge some commonly held perceptions of our ever-changing profession. So um, I've always enjoyed talks that provoke, and maybe stimulate conversation in those receptions and dinners that are part of a conference. So hopefully I can leave you with something to ponder as you make your ways home from the conference after this. So I'm going to try to be more provocative than descriptive. Um, and I'm going to start with my metaphorical title, which probably requires a little bit of explanation. And I also want to mention that I'll be using some alternative imagery during my talk that I've developed using the image generating program Midjourney. So you may or may not know, but for a long time in certain countries, including the United States, automobile manufacturers were required to place the phrase, "objects in the mirror are closer than they appear," on side-mounted mirrors, because the shape of those mirrors created an optical illusion or a deception that the distance of what the driver could see was not quite right. And so the objects that were shown in the mirror were sometimes closer than they appeared. So that might be other vehicles, that might be bicyclists, that might be pedestrians. And so the statements were intended to remind drivers not to change lanes or pull into traffic based on the visual information they were provided. And they encouraged drivers to use their own eyes rather than believing conditions suggested by the mirror as a reflection of reality. So they reminded drivers to be cautious. So as Melton mentioned, I'm a historian and a designer. And balancing each of these identities has really caused me to spend my career looking back with one of my eyes and forward with the other. And in doing so, I've finally kind of been convinced that interior design balances on a fulcrum that reflects the past while offering inspiring views of the future. So just as my title suggests, it's seeming more and more like the distance between one and the other, the past and the future, are diminishing as new directions for our profession emerge at an increasingly rapid pace. Now, sometimes I fear that this is just something that people say once they've reached a certain age. As you now know, I've been teaching in large public universities in America and Canada continuously since 1988. That's 35 years. It's hard for me to believe. And I originally, when a student, learned to draft by hand, laboring over sheets of vellum and mylar, making as perfect marks as I could with lead and then ink, using a T-square and architectural scale rule and raft of triangles of various sizes and angles. I still have a dark spot on the palm of my hand where a super pointy lead once embedded itself, and I can easily conjure the chemical smell of the blueprint machines that transformed my precious translucent pages into thick Prussian blue sheets that were covered in white lines that took the place of my carefully crafted black ones. So being a student in the mid-1980s in the United States also meant that I learned to draft using AutoCAD. And how I welcomed the ability to construct drawings in layers and that liberating ability to undo mistakes. That was the big deal. So it was life-changing. And even though I didn't yet own a computer, using the university computer lab alongside my classmates I think it gave us all a newly found sense of accomplishment. And since that time, the rise of personal computing and advancements in 3D modeling software, and of course, the development of immersive technologies like AR and VR have moved the horizon of possibility in terms of visualizing interior space. And just about every other dimension of life, of course, has now been affected by the integration of computational processes. They're in our work, in our play, when we're learning, and in almost any form of communication. That I'm able to sit here in my home office in Ohio today and speak to you in Turkey would have been beyond my belief when I was 25 years old and when I bought my first computer that looked like this one. It was an IBM desktop with no hard drive, and that was in 1986. So we've come a long way. I embarked upon my career as a design educator at the ripe old age of 26, and I've spent my entire career teaching in those 4 public universities that have given me the opportunity to teach interior design in 4 very distinct contexts. So even though you were kind of given them in my introduction, I'm going to review them very briefly with you here as well. So I started off at my alma mater, which was Iowa State University. It's in Ames, Iowa, and it's the star that's kind of in the middle of the map of the United States. I began there in the interior design program, and at that time it was one of 7 areas of study in the Department of Art and Design. And things have changed there since then. But at the time, I found it really interesting to teach a curriculum that was built very much on a combination of design and art practices. And then I had the good fortune of following that with a near decade-long stint in the architecture school at the University of Oregon. That's the star over there on the left-hand edge. And there, the interior architecture and architecture programs at the time were taught together in the same department, and they had a tightly intertwined curriculum that really frequently brought students from both programs together. And they were also both studio intensive 5-year programs taught on trimesters. So that meant that the students had this amazingly rich, varied opportunities to study design a lot. At the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg in Canada, that's the blue star at the top of the map, which of course is not the top of North America. That school sought me out as an administrator, which was a bit of a career shift. And I spent 5 years there as the chair of an autonomous Department of Interior Design. And that was a joy after spending the first 2 decades of my career really focusing on helping allied programs succeed. And there, the accredited interior design degree is a master's degree. And that was also a really interesting dimension of that program. So now I'm at Ohio State, the star that's just underneath the Great Lakes. And here I spent 9 years as the department chair and for the past 2 years have been a professor. And while chair, I was leading an interior design program, but also industrial design and visual communication design. And we have an MFA in design here at Ohio State as well. And so I was quite fascinated by the commonalities as well as the differences between these various design practices because we are not formally affiliated with the architecture school here at Ohio State. So our programs really focus on shared interests in collaborative design, in design research, and in storytelling and design, and through design. So the academic focus of all of my adventures have really made me more of an observer of the design profession than an actual participant, but of course I'm a researcher. And so I do feel well positioned to analyze contemporary considerations about interior design education and practice, and I know that's the focus of your symposium. I don't know when or if I'll have the opportunity to address an esteemed audience like yours again, so I've chosen to use the time here in my talk to look backward and forward at what seemed to me like just a handful of really critical challenges that contextualize what we do. Challenges that I see as being met with a kind of tense combination of courage and fear. And my perspective on these conditions will be admittedly American. And I apologize for that because I realize you're a very global audience. So I do hope that any conversation we're able to generate here before my session ends might really help illuminate how the points I'm going to raise might differ from or be expanded by a multicultural perspective. So one of the most challenging things about being an interior design educator through the latter part of the 20th century and the first quarter now of the 21st is the presence of some very perennial issues that seem to just never be resolved. And so despite being a dynamic profession that's seen so many advancements, some of which I've reviewed here, I have observed that there are certain issues or conditions that continue to create hurdles or roadblocks that get in the way of preparing interior design to lead into the future. So what motivates me is my belief that people who graduated, students who graduated in the 1960s or like me in the 1980s, the year 2000, and even folks who graduated as recently as 2020, might all likely express similar frustrations at having to explain or correct misperceptions about interior design to almost anyone they meet. And at some point, I guess I feel like we have to accept our role in sustaining these misperceptions. So I suggest that this might be done by addressing what are actually fears that I think hold us back. So I'm going to explore 3 of those here with you today, starting with this one. So the first fear I've identified is certainly not new, and it's actually shared by people working in many, if not most, professions today, from workers performing physical tasks to those who are primarily in charge of decision-making. I'm talking about interior designers' fear that technology will replace us. We hear suggestions about this potential a lot in the context of emerging technologies, expanding use, and the rise of artificial intelligence, or AI. And of course, this fear is not new. In fact, it's quite old. And a glance into the mirror toward the past quickly affirms this. Have you ever heard of a lamplighter? Maybe not, but even though lamplighting was a 500-year-old profession prior to the electrification of cities and the invention of the electric streetlight, how do you suppose 19th century tailors felt about the introduction of the automated sewing machine? Probably a lot like 20th century auto workers felt about the debut of robots on assembly lines. Or maybe like financial analysts feel every time new software and management systems emerge on the market. So anxiety over replacement by technology is not unique to interior design. Neither is it unfounded if it ignores technology's implications or its possibilities to support new ways of thinking and working. Now, I'm not saying all interior designers are doing that, but I am suggesting that many might be late to the game. And maybe it's not the first time this has happened. So AutoCAD was introduced by Autodesk in 1982. And it took about a decade or so for the widespread adoption in interior design education and practice as instructors and practitioners scrambled to learn new software while offices and educational institutions hustled to build and furnish computer labs. And this was all happening when I was an undergraduate, as I've pointed out. And I'd argue that AutoCAD's use may have contributed to cementing the divide between so-called contract design and residential design, because its use was interpreted as evidence of a heightened level of professionalization for commercially oriented design programs and for those designers. So the speed and the accuracy and the 2D to 3D rendering capability of ever improving software extended to building information modeling, or BIM software, at the start of the 21st century. And it's been enhancing designers' ability to design and visualize space in more realistic ways ever since. So for reference, Autodesk Revit was introduced in 2000. Today, BIM data can be exported into virtual reality compatible formats that allow designers to provide fully immersive experiences of their proposed designs to their clients or others who have a stake in simulating, experiencing, or analyzing potential new environments. I think this is all fantastic news because these technologies are amazing tools for designers. And these are not actually the technologies that we fear replacing us. So it's really the rise of an evolution of specialized interior design software that has extensive libraries for furniture and fixtures and finishes, as well as tools that provide sort of cookie cutter approaches to space planning, material selection, and budgeting that replicate some of designers' expertise. So we're also seeing this rise in free or almost free AI-generated interior design tools that seem currently focused on the redesign, or maybe we might even say the redecoration of rooms that are mostly residential in type, but sophisticated professional tools to take on more complex design challenges are working their way into the hands of designers and non-designers alike. So designers' current fear of AI typically centers around, I think, several things. One is job displacement. Another is this sort of notion of the potential diminishment of human creativity when we have a growing dependence on technology. There's also the use of private data about existing interior projects being used to train AI tools to perform design tasks, and doubts about the quality of solutions they produce, as well as some complex ethical questions about whether biases are proliferating through AI's use. And in case you're wondering, this is what AI has to say about the threat of AI to the interior design profession. It says, according to ChatGPT, overall, while AI holds promise for revolutionizing the interior design industry, designers have legitimate concerns about its potential impact on creativity, employment, privacy, quality, ethics, and the future of their profession. So addressing these concerns will be crucial for ensuring that AI technologies enhance rather than undermine the practice of interior design. So there are, of course, many anticipated and established ways of using AI to improve interior design processes and practices, and they began in the early 2010s. And they expedite the analysis of traffic flow patterns and spatial requirements, even user preferences about spatial layouts. AI can automate repetitive tasks and optimize efficiency. And it can stay up to date on the latest trends in color and products and finishes. E-commerce platforms, as many of us know, have widely embraced using algorithms to make personalized product recommendations. And these can be used to help communicate design preferences and align design visions. And the immersive potential of virtual and augmented reality provides a way to visualize space that Florence Noel Bassett and the Noel Planning Unit could only dream of in the 1940s and 1950s. And yes, as a generative tool, algorithms can produce design options that consider parameters and constraints and objectives very quickly. So quickly that their use has conjured a nostalgia for the bold questioning of norms that were undertaken in the 1960s and 1970s by firms of the past like Archigram and by people like Buckminster Fuller, who are celebrated in history for their capacity to dream. And generative algorithms and emerging technology are shaping new approaches to design practice, such as those being explored by the firm Emerging Objects and by nervous systems. You can see the names of the designers here on the screen. I hope this vase behind me over my shoulder is a 3D printed clay vase by Emerging Objects. And all of these efforts are producing new aesthetic possibilities that I actually think are very deserving of much more consideration than they're getting. All right, fear number 2. So part of the reason we look in the mirror is to see who we are. Our reflection also invites us to explore what others see when they look at us. And part of what has challenged many design educators in the 21st century has been the call to reorient our approach to defining the value of our references. We're also faced with meeting the expectation that what we do will be broadly relevant. To meet the heightened concerns of our time, educators of all kinds have faced increasingly vocal calls to decolonize the ways that interior design knowledge is framed, interpreted, prioritized, and shared. And interior design is just one of many disciplines that are the recipients of this kind of mandate. So the basic premise of decolonization is that we must learn to acknowledge that actions in the past have taken critical power imbalances for granted and have not recognized or cared about the fact that Western perspectives on what matters have typically been privileged over others. And this is an issue that applies to how we work, what we make, and how we assign value to design outcomes. And given that we live in a multicultural global world in the 21st century, why would we be afraid of such reconsideration? Why do we avoid the elephant in the room? So in my quest to remove presumptions of colonial privilege from my own teaching, I've come to understand that there are many reasons to resist this effort. Although please don't think that my mentioning them here means that I subscribe to them. I don't. The call to decolonize our profession is largely a call for re-education. And because the task of unlearning may be intimidating to many who practice or teach, it's met with exhaustion and feelings of not knowing where to start. And with everything seemingly on the move, the evolution of computational technology I just mentioned, along with the emergence of new ways of building, new building systems, new sustainable materials, all of that and more. Having to reconceptualize how power has been and is established and maintained may just simply be more than some designers think they can handle. So the good news is that there is an ever-expanding amount of great new research being done and published that repositions and expands the narrative of interior design's past and present in very compelling ways. So as long as you're willing to keep learning, there's never been a better time to study or teach design, especially history. And I think a second reason for feeling afraid of decolonizing interior design knowledge is that such an effort implies that things that have always mattered may not matter anymore, at least not as much as we thought it did. And again, there may be resistance to subtracting the canon from the narrative or reconsidering long-held beliefs about what good design is. Let me give you a little aside here. I saw some evidence of this when I joined a panel to speak on this topic at the most recent Interior Design Educators Conference in New York in March. And while we had a good-sized room with many eager and supportive scholars and teachers who embraced the possibility of unlearning the priorities of the colonial project, there was at least one very prominent voice in the crowd that shared that what mattered to him was that his interior design students be taught about a particular chair by Mies van der Rohe. Now, I am sure that he was just using this as an example. But it was clear that he found the notion of altering the curriculum away from a modernist and a Eurocentric point of view to be threatening. And I'm sure that if more people were willing to say the quiet part out loud, they would ask that traditional curricula only be altered if the new way of constructing knowledge didn't supplant much of what had always been taught. So there's comfort in the familiar. We know that. I've been experimenting with shifting the content of my own history curriculum over the past several years as new scholarship becomes available and, quite frankly, as the expectations of my students have shifted toward giving power to the stories of past acts that have traditionally been hidden from view. The revelation that the history of interiors is not just the history of spaces that have been defined by the walls of famous buildings designed by architects is both liberating and inspiring. What can be learned from the study of non-Western subjects and vernacular and everyday interiors, which you heard are some of my favorite topics, or from works that have been produced by only recently discovered designers, many of whom are women and many are designers of color. It's just as rich as the contents of canonical texts of the past century. And even when we do include the study of so-called seminal canonical works in the curriculum, we can use a different lens to understand them. So I'm a fan of contemporary research of historians like Deborah Silverman, who take topics that we think we know well, and they show us that our previous readings of these designs have ignored what was hidden between the lines. In Silverman's case, her work from 2011 on Belgian modernism, including the very well-known and published works of Victor Horta and Henry van de Velde, reveals how Belgium's colonizing role in the Congo is actually celebratory in the way that it's featured in these acclaimed interiors of Horta's own house, also in his work in the Tassel Hotel and his renovation design for Van Eitveld. Edmund Van Eitveld was actually the Secretary General of the Congo Free State. And essentially, he served as King Leopold's unofficial minister of the Congo. So each of Horta's projects contains abstract gestures that resemble elephants. And once you know that, you can't unsee them. And they also contain mesmerizing, whiplashing tendril patterns that take on new meaning when layered with the knowledge of just how many rubber vines were harvested in the Congo and shipped back to Belgium. And of course, the role of literal whips when enforcing the acts of collecting ivory tusks and rubber vines contributes to the ominous contemporary rereading of these designs through a lens that acknowledges the role of colonization in their creation. While maybe not as specific to interior design, the scholarship of Dori Tunstall is also helpful because it serves as a very strong reminder that understanding cultures that have historically been treated as the other goes far beyond representing their aesthetics and their patterns. Her focus on integrating indigenous culture into design knowledge stresses the importance of listening to and engaging indigenous communities as an authentic means of integrating cultural knowledge into the design process. And in all honesty, the graphic designers are way in front of the interior designers in this effort to develop decolonized design knowledge, in my opinion. Books like The Black Design Experience, Identity, Expression, and Reflection from 2022. Another great book called Baseline Shift, Untold Stories of Women in Graphic Design Identity from 2021. And there's even Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers, also from 2021. All of these kinds of books and more provide historic and contemporary inclusive design knowledge that expands what matters in their discipline. So maybe this makes sense because the focus of their practice is communicating messages using visuals, while interiors are more often viewed as reflections of their occupants and may be interpreted as more neutral in their meaning. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we have a lot more work to do. Fear number 3, and this is the last one. Picture yourself sitting down on an airplane. Settling into your seat, you exchange pleasantries with the person seated next to you, during which time they ask you what you do. Did any of you feel a little tremor at that thought? Maybe it's a question raised at a cocktail party where folks are even freer with their reactions and their responses. I'm an interior designer, you say. And what do they say in return? Maybe they say, that sounds like fun. It is. Maybe they say, my wife's really good at that. They might say, that's what I always wanted to be, but getting a degree in business just made more sense. And of course, the ever popular, oh, so you're a decorator. How many times in your lives have you had this conversation? Now picture yourself walking down the halls of an architecture school. You walk past a group of students who are discussing the courses they plan to take next year. It's architecture for me, says one student who you know is at the head of the class. I thought I'd check out interiors, says another. A suggestion that may be met with some rebuke. You mean inferior design? They laugh. Where did they learn that response? Did they learn it from other professors? So my third and final point about the perennial fears that challenge interior design to assert itself as a confident leader among the design professions requires us to look in the rearview mirror once again to study what we really see. I'm going to argue that one of the reasons it's not as easy to do as we might think, is that to varying degrees, the history of the interior design profession is infused with shame. Why are we ashamed of interior design? I believe that the reasons for the shame have morphed over the years, and also that they have declined, although I don't believe they have dissipated completely. Prior to the turn of the 20th century, interiors received a lot of attention from the mostly male architects who were responsible for their creation. And scholars have argued, however, that the emergence of modern design's propensity for form giving and composition solidified new identities for architecture, and the expertise in the design of interiors shifted from men to women, who were studying many times under the guise of home economics in universities at an increasing rate. At least this was true in the United States. And I agree with your first keynote speaker, Sally Stone. She noted in a recent interview that the piece of the modern agenda, that privileged composition, established that interiors are simply space that is determined by where the architects placed the walls. And if we pair this assertion with the shift toward giving responsibility for the finishing of interiors to women and also to gay men, as design historian John Potvin has convincingly asserted, then the status of this so-called new feminized profession was doomed from the start. Some of the destabilization that surrounds concepts of the interior throughout the past century has to do with the lack of permanence of interiors. Their interior space is slippery, it's fluid, it's temporary, an entity that is never really fixed. And some have speculated that that's what makes the profession of architecture so uncomfortable with imagining interior design as an equal partner. The perception that interior spaces are really a reflection of their occupants, as I noted a minute ago, more than the domain of their creators, is a reminder that control over what happens in the interior is malleable. So I want to echo the ideas of others who have suggested that interior designers have been their own worst enemies when it comes to this shame. Because as the fight for professionalization, again, this is very maybe specific to the United States or North America, but as the fight for professionalization has been waged, interior designers have reinforced their own language of shaming by determining who can and who can't access a professional identity. I'm not a decorator, we loudly and proudly declare, while drawing lines between types of interior design practices through the crafting of accreditation standards and the drafting of questions on licensure and certification exams. So historians, again, like John Potvin, frequently use the rearview mirror to remind us effectively of just who the decorators of the early and mid 20th century were. Give you a second to read the caption here. They were women with good taste, and that usually went hand in hand with access to wealth. And they were gay men whose innate creativity and sensitivity supposedly gave them a natural affinity for staging life in varying types of interior spaces. In addition to Potvin, historian Penny Spark, of course, has produced a lot of work, including this book that examines the gendered meaning of taste and its role in design back as far as 1995. And more recently, Christina Wilson has produced a wealth of new inclusive historical knowledge that takes on modern design in the middle of the 20th century. And she looks at advice manuals, but also advertisements in both Life and Ebony magazines, studies the furniture designs and more to study the ways that race and gender and identity influenced and were shaped by modern design. I actually think interior design has benefited greatly from the fields of women's studies and queer studies through their establishment of the notion that gender is a social construction and a fluid condition. And in my current department, as I noted, we have 3 design disciplines: interior design, but also industrial design and visual communication design. And all 3 of them are dominated by women. And the men who do choose to study interior design rarely display any reluctance based on today's gendered perceptions of the field. Now, that doesn't mean that all levels of shame have been eradicated, however, as the industrial designers are often happy to step in to assert their disciplinary superiority, even though it seems to have nothing to do with bias about gender and sexual orientation. Okay, so discussions of shame and fear may not seem like the rousing points of inspiration to close out what I'm sure has been an uplifting and excellent conference. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm going to pull this around to an optimistic message before I finish here. So let's see how I do that. So first, I hope you actually do find it somewhat refreshing to contemplate out loud a few of the long acknowledged challenges that so many of us and our colleagues and students may be experiencing. And as designers, we all know that to create sustainable approaches to solving our problems, we do have to talk about them, their origins, and what keeps them going. A wise American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, noted in his 1933 inaugural address that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He was talking about the severe economic hardships that most Americans were experiencing at the time of his election. And his reassuring words were intended to build trust and promote hope. In the wake of the global pandemic, and in the shadow of uncertainty and hardship and division that blankets so much of the world today, I think FDR's words deserve to be heard again. So how do we set fears about automation, reformation, and our own mortification aside, along with whatever fears seem most relevant to you, wherever you are? How do we put them in their place in the rearview mirror? Now, one step might be to reframe specific fears as a broader problem by acknowledging that what we all really tend to fear is change. Even though designers pride themselves, ourselves, on our ability to flex and flow and reflect and evolve. Changes that involve groups are always hard. But as believers in iterative development, the value of change needs to be embraced, perhaps using the very tools that spark some of our fear in the first place. For instance, what if we focus on changing interior design practice to better meet the needs of more diverse communities? What if we were to become a practice that focuses on the creation of spaces that meet the needs of those whose needs are rarely considered? Right now, interior design AI is mostly reviving formalism as because of it being trained on 2D images of rooms that already exist. And it also because it uses a taxonomic schema to sort and suggest new design ideas from that data. It doesn't understand 3D space very well, or the connection between how spaces look and how they work. And it doesn't understand how to work with people to determine what they really need. We need to find a way to use AI to augment our ability to create spaces that are hospitable to everyone, especially to people who often feel unwelcome or threatened in specific types of environments. Who better to take on this challenge than a profession that has long embraced women and queer designers? In other words, a profession that has been built on the perspectives and experiences of those who have fought and continue to fight for equal status in the world, even today. And what if we teach future interior designers to use emerging AI systems to save the time once spent on mundane tasks for designing the most equitable and sustainable design solutions imaginable? What proportion of these solutions must come from people? And how can machines learn to support us in that mission? And what if we choose to meet learning objectives by empowering the next generation to prioritize making spaces that diminish social hierarchies while increasing the planet's health? Who better to do this than a profession with the capacity to amplify the stories and experiences of people, all people, as a strategy for redefining and expanding its knowledge base? So I'm going to wrap up here with leave you with a few questions or questions that maybe we can use to start a discussion. I'll review them here just briefly with you, and then I'll say thank you. So I'd like us to think about how we might leverage AI's advantages to increase the positive social and environmental impact on interior design. I think it'd be nice if we could talk a little bit about how your research has shifted to create new knowledge that redefines a more inclusive body of knowledge for our profession. And also, what might you do to cultivate a profession that proudly welcomes and encourages the success of a diverse range of future practitioners? So that's what I have for you today. I appreciate your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne, very much for touching base with a lot of the issues that are on our mind. Recent developments in the field, and thank you for your refreshing perspective on all of this, and especially thank you for these questions. I love questions. My students know I always assign them asking questions, so I think they're so valuable for everybody, all of us, to consider. I would like to first ask the floor if anybody has any questions. Yes, please.
Hello, Marianne. I am Gülnur Ballice, your email friend.
Great.
Thank you very much for your kind and informative presentation. I want to ask something about this AI and have you ever used this AI in your design studio or in your courses? And can you please give us some information how you can benefit from these AI applications and your students' behavior about this AI issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I was a little afraid that by focusing on this topic in my talk, I might mistakenly give everyone the impression that I am an expert about AI, which I am not. And I think that we are all probably maybe in the same boat in terms of kind of trying to figure out what's going on as it's actually happening. I did have the good fortune yesterday to spend the day in a meeting with my colleagues, and I happened to ask them this kind of question. So I'll share with you a little bit about what they said. There are many different ways that AI can be used and explored and in the design studio. Some of it has to do with kind of speedy access to information. Of course, all of the time that information has to be checked for accuracy. But in terms of general information, it's fairly reliable. There's also a lot of potential for using it for image generation for the purpose of kind of being inspired or sort of get rid of the fear that comes along sometimes with the blank page or the blank screen. But everyone really agreed that one of the most important things we can be doing in a classroom really of any kind in the use of AI is to help students become more critical about what they ask and then what they get back. And being able to interrogate the kinds of information or the types of images that AI produces is probably the most useful thing we could be doing at this moment, especially until better habits form maybe about being careful and maybe a little bit suspicious and critical about its use. From my own perspective, I typically teach history and have always in the past envisioned that as a type of course in which students were able to sort of practice their writing skills. And so the last year or two have been a kind of wake-up call for me. And I've tried to speak directly to students who use AI to help improve their writing, and am working toward creating a way in which everyone can be much more transparent about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and kind of what is the effect of having used AI in a writing assignment. But it's inevitable, and in many ways it's helpful and useful. So I'm not somebody who is afraid of technology at all, and I think it's kind of a fun design challenge to try to think about ways to leverage the advantages that this technology inevitably will bring to us. So as I'm trying to suggest here, we can concern ourselves with bigger, maybe more important, or maybe more human-oriented exchanges that are also such an essential part of the design process. So I know that was a little bit of a vague answer, but again, I'm not really an expert of integrating AI into studio teaching.
Any other questions? Maybe while the audience is thinking, I may say a couple of things. First of all, I mean, shifting the paradigm to history, interiors history, your area, I agree with you on shifting the canon. Interiors, the history of interiors has shifted the canon from, let me say, architectural history as we know it, the canonical architectural history, towards the history of the built environment. And I, for one, prefer using the term history of the built environment rather than history of architecture, because I think it's more inclusive. And so history of interiors really, and you have written a lot on this subject, so it really provided us an alternative history and gave us perspectives about how we can think of history of the built environment other than this canonical approach. So I agree very much with you about this shifting the canon, you know, the role of interiors history in that way. So I wanted to mention that, and thank you for all of your contribution in this area. I also have a question. And you mentioned about commonalities and differences, right, between or among, I should say, interior design, interior architecture, and architecture, and maybe industrial design is another field related to interior design. So there are some commonalities and differences. And my experience, at least in Turkey, has been over the last decade. I feel like the differences are dissolving. You know, there's still, I mean, we still talk about that, we still complain, and I very much feel for your example of the person sitting next to us in the airplane. I can really relate to that, but still I feel like those differences are getting lesser and the commonalities are growing, and this is happening recently. And you mentioned, you know, sustainability, AI, right? Gender, for one. Accessibility is another that I can think of. And then one of your questions is really thinking about the social aspects of interiors. So all of these, I feel like we're maybe focusing more on commonalities and these issues that relates to all these design professions, and we focus on those more and less on the differences. I mean, I wrote about this subject also, and we talked about it a lot in the 90s, 2000s. And I feel like, you know, we are more of finding ground, common ground. And so I really find your questions here very, very valuable. But how do you feel? I mean, this is how I feel in Turkey, but how are the things in the United States? I'm curious about that.
I'm not sure I can speak for the nation, but I do agree with you that there is a change afoot and a recognition that the approach that needs to be taken to the creation of a responsible built environment for the future is it has to come from a different starting point. And those starting points are getting closer and closer together. And I think that's the way it should be. It's a very healthy development. And my frustration is probably just that it's taking a long time. And also I guess I have to assert that I think it's going to require a kind of generational shift to really take root and be reliable. Because I think it's the hierarchies and the competition between various specific types of design practices have been eroding, but that doesn't mean they're gone. And I can't wait for a time when they are gone. And that doesn't mean that expertise is the same and shared across the board. It really just means that everyone's a kind of equal player in the challenge of doing better in terms of the ways that design is affecting the world. So, you know, here I think it's a little bit different than probably a lot of the places that you all represent, in part because of the way that the professionalization of the various design careers, professions has taken shape. And it's still the case that professional architecture is a licensed profession, and interior design, it handles the issue of certification or licensure from a state to state basis. And so there's a small handful of states that have professional certification for interior design, but in many states like mine, it was attempted to be achieved in the sort of legislative levels of the state, and the architecture lobbyists fight it tooth and nail, and it boils down to economic access to certain types of economic jobs, and so that gets in our way in a way that I think is not necessarily the case in most places, and I'm a little bit jealous of that, in fact, because when you put a group of students in a room to work together, it's fantastic, and it gives me great hope for the future.
Thank you. We do have similar situations, but this was just my observation. Thank you, Marianne. Are there any other questions? There's one back there. Oh, Allison, yeah. I believe you know Allison.
I do know Marianne. I'm
trying Marianne, yeah,
but
I was asking Marianne.
I'm trying to see if I can get in and say hi to you.
So we have Allison Snyder in-house. She has a question for you.
I think I see myself as a little dot. Marianne, I couldn't resist. Hi. And thanks for showing Eugene, Oregon, where we met. We've had a lot of conversation in the last few days over a lot of different words that have been used. And so I think you've seen some of this in the last few days. And it's not quite a debate, I would say, but it's something about things we've seen in other conferences and other research as well about this kind of not only expanding maybe the discipline through the words, but sort of worrying about them. You know, defining, redefining. You said replaced versus place, you know, all of these kinds of things. And I was thinking about your bringing up privilege and power, and thinking about how much we have to continue to rethink these things. And I'm just wondering if you have I have two questions, but one is if you have a position on this idea of reflecting that all of us who've been teaching for a while, or all of us who are teaching, even if it's a shorter time, that it's really ours, that we have to do this. Can we really ask our students to understand power and privilege, and especially for our position in interior design? And then sort of related, I guess I'm also wondering, newly, just this last few days, whether we whether we really have to, I mean, maybe it's okay that we have to keep defending ourselves in interior design, interior thinking. I mean, maybe we shouldn't lose that fight. And I'm thinking it's a little bit of perhaps what you were hinting about, that the good fight has been going on for a while. You know, maybe we don't want it to be, I'm not sure I really believe this, but do we really want to, you know, have everything affirmed and we won, we're finally seen and everything we do is great and everybody understands it? Or maybe it's just actually part of this kind of parsing all the words. So I thought I'd ask. Thanks.
Sure. And Allison, I'm so jealous that you're there and I'm not.
Well, we just saw each other, so you're here with me.
Well, I know, but you get to see Izmir and all the wonderful people there as well. Yeah, it's a good question, I think. And I thought a lot about words as I was kind of crafting my remarks here, because I've always cared a lot about words, and I've also always been kind of careful, I guess, about the ones I choose. And so, you know, I've had things to say in the past about whether we should continue using the name interior design. And I've been an advocate for keeping it. I think there's a case to be made that maybe decolonization isn't quite the right word that we should be using when we're talking about building out a more inclusive sense of ourselves and our history. But at the end of the day, I think sometimes it's good to just sort of default to the word of the day and hope that that maybe helps more people kind of plug into and connect to what you're talking about. Whether or not interior design can ever really explain itself to the general public in a way that makes everybody kind of on the same page about what it means, I think that likely is very wishful thinking on my part, because it means different things in different places, for one. And it also, you know, it has baggage that you can't just ignore. So I think that in and of itself may mean that the good fight is always going to be present, and that maybe leveraging some of the energy that comes along with it can be used to our advantage. But it's I think the question that Meltem asked is a good one about whether or not some of the kind of comparison that has been happening for, you know, decades and maybe centuries, whether some of that has become a little bit dusty, and that we're closer together than we've ever been. You know, that is, I think, something that's going to work to everyone's advantage. But yes, there is definitely something to be said for being a little bit of the outsider's perspective on what should happen next. But if you don't get equal pay and you don't have equal respect of your partners, there's really no way to thrive and succeed fully under those conditions, and we need to not accept them. And I know you agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Well, I don't see any. So I think we can close the session here, but before we let you go, Marianne, we would like to present to you, well, Yaşar University, as a token of appreciation, wants to plant a tree in your name. So we would like to present this certificate for this tree to you.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Sustainable. We are trying to be sustainable and we love nature, so.
That's wonderful. It makes me feel a lot better about not getting on a plane.
Yeah, this is the certificate, I guess, of participation, and this is the certificate for the tree. Yeah. Thank you again so much. And I think, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really been a lot of fun.